It's easy to assume that war is all about weapons. Missiles, artillery, drones, aircraft, and especially Russia's thousands upon thousands of tanks have all defined the Ukraine war, for instance. But beyond the weapons, tactics are key. And in some cases, the countries defending themselves against aggression find that Mother Nature herself can come to the rescue. Finland and Poland are learning that right now. The two countries have just come up with a bizarre way to wipe out Russian armor, and if they can pull it off, Vladimir Putin's typical ground-based tactics will be in serious trouble if he launches a war against NATO. On August 29th, Euromaidan Press reported that Finland and Poland appear to have found the perfect response to Russia rebuilding its conventional forces after losing so much of its armor against Ukraine. This defense isn't some new form of anti-tank missile or a revolutionary new drone. It's a feature of both countries' landscapes that were part of their makeup for centuries until they were drained so the land could be used for modern purposes. What are those features? The wetlands. Specifically, restored peat bogs could become the latest and perhaps greatest line of defense against Russia, and we only need to look back to a little earlier in 2025 to discover why. Sadly, the example Euromaidan Press highlights was a complete accident, as 4 US soldiers stationed in Lithuania and operating an M88 Hercules found themselves trapped in a bog. All 4 lost their lives, unable to escape on foot, and with their armored recovery vehicle rendered useless. Though a tragedy for NATO, the incident highlighted just how effective these types of wetlands can be when used as part of a country's defensive setup. We'll get back to that point later in the video. Returning to Finland and Poland's plans, they were first reported on by Politico, which spoke to representatives of both nations to discover they are actively exploring the possibility of restoring previously drained bogs in their countries to defend against Russian tanks. Poland has already built the concept into its $2.69 billion Eastern Shield project, with a statement provided by the country's defense ministry saying that the project provides for environmental protection, including by peatland formation and forestation of border areas. France 24 provides more information, noting that Finland's defense and environment ministries will start talks in the fall to arrange the launch of a new peatland repair project, though what that project will look like remains to be seen. Similar discussions are taking place in Poland, with France 24 noting that the Polish equivalents of these ministries are also speaking to scientists to see what can be done. A state secretary at Poland's defense ministry, Cezary Tomczyk, explains why in a simple statement. Nature is an ally, and we want to use it. And it may not just be these two nations getting involved. Some in Germany are also highlighting how important wetlands can be for military tactics. Among them is the Greifswald Meyer Center, which is a peatland think tank. Back in June, it encouraged the European Union, or EU, to consider investing up to $580 million on restoring 38.6 square miles of wetlands, offering a clear military reason for doing so. Naturally wet and equally re-wetted peatlands are impassable for tanks, slowing down troop movements and forcing predictable corridors that are easier to defend, the think tank said in a statement. Peatlands offer additional protection for critical infrastructure by making troop movements near transport routes, energy facilities, and strategic supply points more difficult. The think tank has a good point, several of them, in fact. And to make matters worse for Russia, the measures that Poland and Finland are considering right now just so happen to align with something that NATO could implement if the idea gains greater traction. As Politico points out, it just so happens that a lot of Europe's wetlands, both those that still exist and those that have been drained, combine to form what it calls a bog belt. It notes that most of the EU's wetlands stretch across the borders that its nations share with Russia and Putin's ally Belarus, essentially creating a natural border that could be transformed into an incredibly effective barrier. These wetlands stretch from Finland's Arctic regions, through the Baltic states, past the dangerous Suwalki Gap, and into eastern Poland, the outlet says. But by now, more than a few of the military historians watching this video will be thinking the same thing. Using wetlands to slow down advancing armies isn't a new concept. They're absolutely right. For centuries, the wetlands that Poland and Finland are considering reviving have been used to provide the nations that host them with impressive military advantages. Politico highlights several examples. In AD 9, the Germanic tribes of ancient Europe were able to use their bogs to trap Rome's marauding soldiers, trapping them so they became easy pickings for assaults. Russia itself has more than enough experience falling foul of Europe's bogs, Politico adds. During the 1940s, when the Soviet Union was trying to invade Finland, the wet borderlands of Russia's target proved to be a difficult barrier to cross. Finland's Pauli Auto Satala, who is part of the country's governing National Coalition Party, is more than aware of this latter example. Speaking after filing a parliamentary motion that prompted Finland's upcoming talks, Auto Satala said, "In Finland, we have used our nature from a defense angle in history. I realized that at the eastern border especially, there are a lot of excellent areas to restore, for the climate, but also to make it as difficult to go through as possible. Sticking with Finland, France 24 adds that the country had several obvious areas that could be subject to re-wetting. These include large portions of the country that have in the past been drained to promote forestry, only for trees to fail to grow on the drained land. Now practically useless, those areas are prime candidates for Finland's new plan. It's very logical to wet these large areas again, says Christina Lang of the Natural Resources Institute of Finland. And if we need to re-wet part of our peatlands anyway, then why not close to the eastern border? Finland could go further than that. She notes that about a third of Finland is made up of the type of peatland that could now become a vital weapon against Russia. However, half of that land has already been drained. Much of it won't be usable in Finland's new strategy. The land was drained for forestry or to create land useful in domestic agriculture. But in examples where draining hasn't given any decent results, why not re-wet the land to make it dangerous for Russian soldiers to cross? After all, Putin has made plenty of threats against Finland since the beginning of the Ukraine war. Most of those threats were made during the build-up to Finland joining NATO, which Putin saw as a threat to Russia. Back in December 2023, CNN reported that Putin made a vague threat of problems for Finland if it joined the collective defense organization. It did, and though we still haven't seen these problems manifest into direct military action, it's not hard to make the leap that Putin is thinking about a future fight with Finland and its NATO allies as revenge for too many countries not doing what he wants them to do. As for Poland, discussions about revitalizing wetlands have been taking place for years, though they've only just now started reaching the government level, Politico says. Victoria Jedrzejkowiak, who is a climate activist and one of the guiding forces for Poland's Fridays for Future climate protests, points out that the stars are aligning now. Once you talk about security, everyone listens right now in Poland, she tells Politico. And our peatlands and ancient forests, those are the places that are going to be very important for our defense once the war gets to Poland as well. Many in Poland are now realizing that nature can be their greatest ally. With its defense ministry involved, it likely won't be long until we start hearing plans for restoring the country's wetlands. And like Finland, Poland has a lot of wetlands that it could restore. These types of land account for about 5% of Poland's entire area, though it may have a tougher time restoring it than Finland. Waterlands says that about 85% of Poland's peatlands have been drained, likely for the purposes we mentioned earlier. So some tough decisions will have to be made regarding which to restore, especially if wetlands near Poland's most vulnerable borders are now home to farms or even entire communities. Still, these are decisions that have to be made. The military benefits are too massive, which brings us to what these wetland restorations will mean for a future Russian invasion of either Poland or Finland. It's simple. Wetlands cause major problems for tanks. We've touched on this already with the example of the 4 US soldiers who unfortunately lost their lives when they were trapped in wetlands. But what was an unhappy accident for a handful of NATO soldiers could spell doom for any Russian invasion. After all, Putin loves using tanks. We know that from the sheer number of them Russia has lost in its Ukraine invasion. Ukraine's Ministry of Finance says that Russia has lost 11,151 tanks up to August 31st, with 2 more being destroyed on August 30th alone. For Russia, tanks are vital to the mechanized assaults it launches against enemy fortifications. Tanks provide armor for infantry and pack enough firepower to destroy walls and other defenses. Granted, Ukraine has come up with plenty of ways to counter Russia's tanks already. Anti-tank missiles are effective, of course, but it's kamikaze drones loaded with explosives that fly directly into the weak points of tanks that do most of the damage. As the Car Center pointed out in June, Ukraine's drones are now responsible for 85% of Russia's military personnel and equipment losses, with tanks being very near the top of that list. Perhaps that use of heavy drones raises the question of why bother revitalizing the wetlands at all. After all, drones are doing a good enough job on their own. Finland, Poland, and all of NATO recognize their impact and have been shifting toward drone-centric military strategies. In fact, Poland is going all in on drones. In 2025 alone, it will spend $55 million on buying drones to make them a key element of its defense strategy. These are all good points. However, imagine how much more effective these drones could be when restored wetlands are involved in a nation's defense. Tanks can't drive through wetlands. Their tracks get stuck, and they're so heavy that they easily become bogged down. These massive metal monsters are hardly the most agile of targets at the best of times, especially when compared to a first-person view drone. But having them come to a complete standstill makes them sitting ducks, and spare a thought for the tank operators in these scenarios. Their first instinct upon seeing an incoming drone against which they can't defend is to bail. They look for an escape on foot, and that escape will elude them in boggy land. Even if the soldiers can move, they may have to march hundreds of feet, perhaps even miles, to get to safe land. That's all while being hindered by the wetlands and moving so slowly they become easy targets for drones. Plus, as we found out from the US example we mentioned earlier, the wetlands can claim lives through exhaustion just as readily as they can slow down potential targets. So Russia's tanks and infantry just won't use the wetlands, right? That logical counter falls flat on its face when you consider the simple fact that a defending nation such as Poland or Finland knows precisely where its wetlands are. With that knowledge, they can use their bogs and wetlands to funnel enemy soldiers into ambushes. We've seen this tactic plenty of times before. Both Ukraine and Russia use massive minefields to ferry opposing troops into locations where they can be hit by artillery and similar ambushes. In many respects, restored wetlands will serve the same purpose as minefields, destructive to anybody foolish enough to traverse them and assistive to soldiers looking to lay ambushes. Combat archaeology notes that wetlands are ideal for nations that use guerrilla warfare. Unlike other environments, wetlands are able to fulfill all of Clausewitz's criteria for guerrilla warfare, including the ability to be carried out in the interior of a political zone, extending over a considerable portion of a country, occurring irregularly, being difficult in nature, being unreliant on a single strike, and having the ability to gather the support of the community, the outlet says. It's referring to writings by Karl von Clausewitz from the 19th century, but the points being made stand today. And guess which nation has been using guerrilla warfare against Russia? Ukraine. What Poland, Finland, and several other NATO nations have is land that is ideal for use in the very type of strategy that counters Russia's preferred means of aggression. Heavy mechanized assaults can be countered using wetlands, and even if Russian tanks somehow make it through unscathed, they'll be slowed down to such an extent that those nations using their wetlands will be able to prepare fortifications and mount far more damaging defenses against Russia's exhausted invading soldiers. Russia is no stranger to this type of strategy. It's long used its own hostile environment to wear down invading armies to the point where exhaustion and natural attrition are as important to Russian victories on their own land as the country's tactics. Now Putin is dealing with a pair of nations that are considering using a very similar approach against him. Did we say a pair? It may be much more than that. We mentioned that at least one German think tank is already imploring the country's government to use wetlands as defensive assets. But beyond Germany, Poland, and Finland, there are others. Ukraine, for instance, would love to restore its wetlands. In June, Euromaidan Press published a piece in which it noted that Russia's surprise assaults against Ukraine via Belarus may not have succeeded were it not for the decades-old Soviet programs that eliminated the wetlands in much of Ukraine's north. If those wetlands were still there, Russia would have had a much harder time gaining territory in Ukraine's north than it did during the initial days of the invasion. There are now calls for Ukraine to bring back its wetlands as best as it can. The cost isn't necessarily a problem. The cost of restoring a single hectare of wetland runs between a couple of $100 and a couple of $1,000 in the country, depending on the location. It's time that Ukraine doesn't have. Full re-wetting takes between 2 and 4 years, Euromaidan Press reports. That's fine for the likes of Finland and Poland, which have the time to dedicate to the task. But for Ukraine, which is engaged in a very active war, wetland restoration has to fall on the back burner, no matter how useful it might be. There is also talk in some of the Baltic states about following Finland and Poland's lead. On August 28th, Politico reported that Estonia had become another EU nation to launch ministerial talks exploring the possibility. Speaking to Politico, a spokesperson for Estonia's climate ministry said, "I can confirm that we have started early discussions with the Ministry of Defense and would like to include them in a nature restoration project." Those talks are still in their very early stages, but they prove an important point. The wetland restoration concept has legs as a viable military tactic. It also doesn't hurt that wetlands are good for the environment, meaning they allow nations like Poland and Finland to counter Russia's aggression in another way. There's no denying that the Ukraine war has been a climate disaster. The World Wildlife Fund notes that entire ecosystems have been destroyed, and the country has experienced 78 times more fire incidents than it did the year before Putin launched his invasion. In Russia, Ukraine has been using a series of devastating deep strikes to take out oil refineries. Those strikes are effective. They've disrupted around 17% of Russia's total refining capacity, but these strikes, combined with others targeting fuel sources, send a lot of carbon into the air that might otherwise have been released over a much longer period. Wetlands, particularly peatlands, can counter some of this environmental impact. As France 24 notes, peatlands essentially act as carbon sinks, trapping the harmful material in the land rather than allowing it to escape into the atmosphere. This environmental benefit is the reason you've heard so many mentions of environmental and defense agencies working together in this video, and they may prove vital to this bizarre strategy coming to fruition. As Politico reports, the EU has recently passed the Nature Restoration Law, which requires EU countries to restore 30% of their degraded peatlands by 2030 and 50% by 2050. That law gives all EU nations until September 2026 to create draft plans covering how they'll meet these ambitious targets. Call it providence, coincidence, or synergy, but this seems to be a rare case of environmental and defense agencies working toward the same cause rather than butting heads against one another. Finland and Poland's upcoming plans are now going to be part of a continent-wide environmental project that just happens to be very useful for defense against Russia. There's just one problem to confront. It's not easy to restore peatland, especially when that land has been developed for other purposes. Beyond the time constraints we mentioned earlier, the very act of making previously wet land wet again comes with some risk. Deliberate flooding of land could be seen as an option, for instance. Ukraine did that back in March 2022 when it destroyed the Kozyrovchi Dam to create makeshift wetlands that succeeded in slowing down Russia's troops. However, this kind of strategy comes with a lot of pitfalls, not least of which is the introduction of toxic materials from reservoirs into these new lands. As Mark van der Waal, who works with the International Union for Conservation of Nature, notes, if you re-wet rapidly, then you just end up with a lake, basically, and not necessarily with all the biodiversity that you might envisage. That may not matter from a military perspective. Rapid re-wetting could even be better for defense for the obvious reason of allowing wetland barriers to be created quickly. However, the synergy we are starting to see between defense and environmental agencies would disappear, which would cause such projects to end up so mired in red tape that the speed advantage is lost. So we have the talks. Poland and Finland are having them. Estonia is too. And thanks to a new EU law, NATO's eastern flank could soon become a wetland wonderland that will bog down Russia's armor so much as to render it practically useless. Putin has a lot to think about now. But Russia's leader and his soldiers are more than familiar with their enemies using unique and bizarre methods to counter their aggression. Take drones, for example. Ukraine has come up with a genius way to outsmart Russian drones, and it's far simpler than you might think. Find out more in our video, and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more video commentary on the latest developments in European defense. And thank you as always for watching.